Welcome to the Mean SF Developers. This is our first official meetup. I'm actually re-recording the talk that I gave at the first meetup. There's been some requests for that, which is great, so I'm happy to run through it, record it, and post it up there. So, like I said, I'll just get started here. I'm Mike Moser. I'm a full-stack entrepreneur. I've been building software for over 15 years. I'm the co-founder at Split VR. It's the easiest way to find, split, and book vacation rentals with your friends and family. It's all powered by our group payment platform called Human Gravity, so it has a great social payment aspect to it. I'm also an independent contractor. When the right project comes around, I love to sink my teeth into it. A few fun facts about myself. I've been personally nominated for 3 Emmys for the work that I did with NBC Sports for Sunday Night Football Extra, as well as the Vancouver 2010 Olympics. A lot of live video and live video experiences that we put together for them. And I grew up in Alabama, which can be, don't meet a lot of people around here that have. So, great. Thanks. I want to do a special thanks to Geekdom by Rackspace. They have an awesome co-working space here, and they've got this great venue for this meetup. So they provide the venue as well as free beer. So there's a tap in the back. I also want to thank Justin Keller for being awesome. He works out of Geekdom here, and he's the founder of Commando.io. If you want to manage your servers more easily, you should check out his software. It helps you through a GUI interface do SSH management of all of your servers. He hooked us up with the venue, so thank you very much. What is this group all about? So it's the Mean Stack, which is Mongo, Express, Angular, and Node. And I want to kind of cover, it's a big stack. There's a lot to cover. So we can kind of grow the group and figure out together how we want this to move forward. But ultimately, we're going to talk about how these technologies work together and how we build applications. And I think there's kind of 2 categories of applications that we can talk about. One, where we're using the stack, which is great for this, is to build these quick MVP prototypes to get things out there and test ideas. And we can build great quality apps quickly with this stack. But also talk about how we take those apps to scale. How do we build teams around them? How do we, bring on tons of, traffic and kind of our more enterprise level applications. So I want to talk about this stack in both contexts, the quick MVP kind of stack, an application for the stack, and then the taking this stack to scale. So I'm open to ideas, and we'll kind of work on building this meetup together and seeing how it shapes. Today, I'm going to go breadth first, not depth first. So my plan is to introduce each technology, and I'm just going to, assume that you know some about the technologies, and I'm just going to touch on a couple of key points. And along the way, I'm going to get out of these slides, and I'm going to be touching the technology for real and building an application with the Mean Stack end-to-end. So my idea here is to build an end-to-end application using all these technologies to show how they fit together. I'm not going to be building an enterprise application today. I'm going to be building just the bare minimum to go through and show how each of these technologies work together to build an application. So if we have time, which I don't think we'll have a ton of time, so we'll just touch on some tools and start to touch on some better practices. And then we'll take some time to mingle, drink some of the free beer, and do some Q&A with each other, talk about what we're working on, and what maybe is a good topic for the next meetup. So I'm going to move fast. So there's a lot to do. I'm going to build an application. I'm going to do it with live coding, so end-to-end, showing every step of the way. So I'm going to have to move fast and have to talk fast. So here we go. So MongoDB, it's a NoSQL document database. 2 of the key things I want to talk about today is the fact that it has dynamic schema. So we're not defining tables and relationships and defining exactly how our database is structured before we start to put database into it. Or data into it. We can just put documents directly in the database with whatever schema we like. And those documents will be stored in a binary JSON format. So for those of you that are familiar with JSON, it works really well with JavaScript and Node.js. So this is why this pairing is really great. But MongoDB is more than just a document store. It has full index support on top of it for query optimization. It has map and reduce functionality, as well as an aggregation pipeline that's pretty sweet. And you can take MongoDB to scale, and you can do high availability databases with MongoDB. So it's not just our document store, it has a lot of layered stuff on top of that. Great. If you're not familiar, this is what JSON looks like, and this is what your document would look like in your MongoDB database. So we're going to build an application today that shows a list of meetups and allows us to add a meetup and that type of thing. So let's say that this is our meetup document, and we're going to store it in our meetups collection, which is kind of the equivalent of like a table or organization of your documents in MongoDB. It would have an ID, has a name, mean SF developers, has a speaker, which is another attribute but could be a more complex object and have other kind of a subtype to it. Attendees, which could be an array of other types, and they're just kind of, you know, a list of those. So this is just a sample of what a document might look like, but we can get even more complicated than this, but this is a very basic example of a document that we'd store. So let's get out of these slides and take a look at MongoDB and go hands-on for a second. So what I'll do is let me just open up a terminal. I'm going to assume, let me actually make this bigger. I'm going to assume that you have MongoDB installed, or you can go out and Google how to do it. So I have MongoDB installed here on my local database. So now I'm running a server and an instance of MongoDB, and it's listening for connections on this port. I'm then going to open up another tab, and I'm going to use the Mongo client, and now my Mongo client has connected to that local instance of MongoDB. One of the things that's great about MongoDB is that I don't need to declare anything up front. I don't have to go configure the database like we talked about before. I just start using things in the database and they get created. So for example, let's use a database called mean demo. Okay, so now we're using this database, and if we show collections, which is how we organize our documents, so it's a certain type of document maybe in this collection that you store, and we're going to store one in meetups, you see that there are no collections. So we can just start to use a collection though, like db.meetups, that's the syntax here for db.collection name, and we're going to insert in here mean SF developers. Great. So now I've inserted that, and if I show collections, MongoDB went ahead and just created that collection for me. It says meetups. And if we look at db.meetups now, and we do a quick find, we'll see that that document is stored in that collection. Awesome. Great. Now this first document doesn't define any schema. Any type of document and schema can be stored in that collection. It's kind of up to us as the application to put the proper documents in the proper collections. So for example, I could create another document. I could just add speaker, Mike Moser, and these guys are just going to live side by side. Great. So that is a very, very basic introduction to MongoDB. Let's go ahead and go back into our presentation, back to our slides, and move on to the next technology. So I'm not going to do it in the acronym order. The acronym order doesn't totally make sense in terms of building up an application. So the next technology I want to talk about is Node.js. Node.js, for those of you that don't know, is JavaScript on the server. And it's runs on Google's V8 engine. The two things that I want to talk about here, just kind of at a high level for Node.js, is that if you're not used to asynchronous programming, that's something that you might need to get used to on Node.js, because all of the programming is non-blocking asynchronous model, and so Node.js runs with a single thread in its process, and so we don't want to block that thread. So everything is done asynchronously with callbacks. And if you've been doing a lot of JavaScript, it'll probably be pretty straightforward for you. But if you haven't been doing that type of model, you'll have to get used to it. If you start to get into a mess with your asynchronous, callbacks, and you're getting these Christmas tree kind of things, check out promises. Check out libraries like async-q, promise.js. They help you organize your callback chains, and you can use nice new organization model for that. The next thing I want to talk about is Node Package Manager. So Node Package Manager is awesome. It allows us access to thousands and thousands of community modules, Node modules that have been written to do different things that your application may want to do. We're going to talk about one of those, which is Express, here in a minute. So we'll dive into Node Package Manager and some of the modules, but that is an essential part of the Node environment. So let's go ahead and jump out of the slides and let's do a basic Node application. So I'm just going to go back over into my terminal and I'm going to create a new tab. And let me just see where I'm at. I want to be in projects. Okay, great. And I'm just going to make a directory and I'm going to call it mean demo. Great. And let me go ahead and actually go in that directory. So now I have an empty directory, and we need to create a couple of files to start our Node application. I use Sublime, so I'm just going to open up Sublime to that folder, and I'm going to create two files. The first file that I'm going to create is package. Oops, let me save that. Package.json. Great, and the most basic package.json, which is essentially the manifest file that describes our Node application, is the bare minimum we need for that is name and version, and that won't error. There will be some warnings. We should put more data in there. We should put more information to describe our application better, but that's the bare minimum that we need. And I'm going to do that a lot today. I'm going to start with just the bare minimum so that we can show the technologies at their core level and how they then build up and how we build an application with them. So I'm going to save that. I'm going to do another file, and this is essentially our main, right? So it could be called main.js, server.js, web.js, whatever you want to name this. This is our main entry point for the Node server. So this is how we'll run our Node application. So I'm going to call mine server.js. Great. And inside of here, I'm going to console.log, and I'm going to say hello from Node. Great. Now I'll flip back over to my terminal now that I have my two files, and I'm just going to say Node, and I'm going to assume that you have Node installed. If not, you can go out and Google it and download it and install it, and you'll have Node installed. And then I can just say Node, and I'm going to run server. And I don't have to say server.js because it knows that it's a JavaScript file. Just say Node server. Okay? Great. And it console.logs hello from Node. So we just built a Node application at the very, very basic level. All right, so let's flip back to our presentation before we move on. The next technology that I want to introduce is Express. So our Node application right now just does a console.log. That's not very interesting. We want our application to do something more interesting. So like I said, with Node Package Manager, we can go out and install these great modules, one of which is Express. And it's a web application framework for Node. And for today's demo, it's going to serve as our HTTP server. So it listens for HTTP requests and responds to those HTTP requests for us. It handles a nice clean syntax for routing, so these different requests that come in, we can route them and handle them in different ways. And it has an awesome middleware component, so you can inject things as things move through your route. You can inject different middleware to handle different things, which we'll also take a look at today. So let's jump out of the slides, go back into our application, and if we go here, let's get rid of console.log, and let's build the most basic Express server we can. So I just did a little snippet here because you don't want to watch me type, but we're going to require Express, which we haven't installed yet, which I'll show you. So why don't I just go ahead and do that. So the first thing that you'll want to do is you'll want to say npm install Express. And npm is installed with Node, which is the Node Package Manager. So once you install Node, you should have npm installed as well, at least if you're installing a later version of Node. So npm install Express. Express is registered with the Node Package Management system as that name, so that's how we know how to install it. And I can say -- save. The reason I put -- save is because as I install this, that will -- save will tell it to go back to my package.json and insert this dependency in here. So I don't have to go and manually do that. So when I install modules into my Node application, I usually use -save to do this for me. Okay, great. So we see that it installed successfully. So let's flip back to our application now. And like I said, in our server, we're now going to require Express because it's a Node module. You can see that our Node modules over here now have Express installed. So Node knows about it. I can require it, I'll set it equal to this variable, and then I can use it. And so for Express, we're going to create a new application. So I just call it app. And on that app, we're going to start to define some routes. And this app.get, get is the HTTP verb. So it's like get, post, put, delete, etc. This one's saying when somebody makes a GET request to our root directory, our root domain, we're going to respond by sending a file named index.html. And I'm organizing it in a certain way here, and we'll get into that a little bit more. So I put index.html a little bit deeper in a folder structure because we're going to add a little bit more meat to this application. I didn't want to just drop it in the root. So we'd actually need to create an index.html, which we'll do in a second. The other thing that we do on our app is we listen, and we listen on a port. I'm in a development environment, so I'm just listening on port 3000, but that tells Express, okay, stay open, stay up, and start listening on this port, and then handle these HTTP requests that come in. All right, so that is the most basic Express server that we can do. So I'm going to go here and create a new folder because we need to create our index.html file. So client, I like to call it client. Some people call it app, some people call it public. I like to come into my project and see client server, so I'm just naming it client, but you could name it whatever you want. Inside of that client folder, I like to organize all my views in another folder. So we now have client and views, and then we'll actually create our index.html file. And inside that index.html file, we'll do the most basic HTML file we can. Probably don't want to watch me type, so I have a little snippet here. This is a very, very basic HTML file. It doesn't include any scripts. It doesn't include any CSS. It's just a basic file that says hello. Obviously, we might want to use something like, HTML5 boilerplate or, modernizer. There's other things that we'd want to include here. We'd want to have, a more robust base HTML file. But for now, we're just going to do this for the demo. Okay. So now that we've got our file, we've got our route. So in our route, if somebody hits this, says get the default domain, the default route, we're going to respond back with index.html. So let's go back here. Let's start up our server. Okay, it says that it's listening, so it should be listening on that port. I'm going to flip over here. Let's start a new browser or a new tab. Go to localhost 3000, and there we go. So we now have a Node server that's using Express to listen for HTTP requests and responding on that GET request with a static index.html. All right, great. So let's go back in here. Actually, let's flip back to our presentation. So that's the very basic Express server. Now let's talk about Angular. So Angular is a client-side MVC framework, model view controller framework. And it allows us to build more dynamic web applications. And it does that, though, by also encouraging the separation of concerns. That's the model, the view, and the controller. So we're building these more interesting dynamic web applications, but we're still keeping the concerns separate. And that means we have a very distinct view, we have a very distinct controller, and we have a very distinct model. What I like about Angular are a few things. So let me touch on a couple of them. I like the declarative UI bindings. So we'll see in the view, which is just our HTML, we'll be able to attribute it and declare a few different things that make it very easy to handle the binding back to the controller. And we'll take a look at that in a little bit. So I really like that aspect of it. It's also embeddable, so you can use as little or as much as you want. So you don't have to say, I've made a decision to go with Angular, I'm going to move my entire application over to Angular, and that's going to be the framework that I use. you could just test it out on a small part of your, or use it on a small part of your application on one part of one page, and you could do something more dynamic. So you don't have to make this all-in decision. Or you could use Angular to go full bore and let it handle your single page app, and you're using a router and you're switching out views and you're using the Angular framework to do all of that. You can also do that. So you can use as little or as much as you want. Finally, Angular does dependency injection, which we'll see. So each of our controllers and these different modules get their dependencies injected into them. And by doing that and inverting the control, we now have more testable front-end code. So we're building things that are more interesting to the client. We're keeping the concerns separate. We're injecting the dependencies. Now we're going to have more maintainable, robust, thicker clients on the web. So that's kind of the idea. All right, so why don't we go ahead and do a quick hands-on. Now I'm just going to pause for a second. Okay, great. I needed to get some power. So let's jump out here and back into our project and do something a little more interesting with Angular. So I just put a little comment down here. So I'm going to take the AngularJS just directly off the CDN and include it as a script in my index.html. Now you could use Bower or other tools to manage this, but again today I'm just trying to show, I don't want to use any generators, I don't want to use any tools, I just want to show the very basics of each of these technologies, how they fit together, and then we can build on that in the future. Great, so now we have AngularJS included. I just removed the .min because in case I have errors while I'm demoing here, I want to be able to debug them a little bit more, get a little bit more friendly error messages. Great. So the other thing that we need to do, now that we have Angular included essentially in our client-side application via the index.html, is we can start to use these declarations here. So we can say ng app. So we need to say this, we need to tell Angular that this HTML page is an application, an ng application. Then from there, what we might want to do is create a more interesting view. So if we have a div, for example, inside of that div, we may want to, and again, we're building an application that's going to show a list of meetups and allow us to add new meetups. So maybe at the top, we want like a header that says there are, and this is where Angular comes in, X number of meetups. Now, what we need to do is, so Angular, I believe, is named after these Angular brackets, and I think NG is like short for Angular, so that it's easier to type. And what we want to do is we want to bind to something. So this is our view right here. This is our meetups view. And we would normally organize these a little bit different, put them in their own folders, or put them in their own files, and include them, and decide which view should be shown here. But for this demo, I'm just going to put the view directly in the body of our index.html, and we'll work with it. But this is our view, and we've talked about model view controller, and we're going to need a controller. So if we're going to bind to something using these Angular tags, like let's say the meetups count, right? Where does that come from? Well, that comes from our controller. So we need to define a controller, ng controller, and we'll give it a name, meetups controller. And now the Angular will look for meetups count on the meetups controller. Now we haven't actually created a meetups controller, so we should do that. Now I prefer inside of my client to have another folder, so we have views, but I like to have a folder for JS for all of our JavaScript. And then inside of there we'll have different types of things. So we'll have controllers and filters and services and different things like that. So I also like to put those all in their own folder, so I would have a folder called controllers. And inside controllers, then we create a new file, and that file would be our meetups controller.js. And that meetups controller.js, again, I'm about to do the bare minimum that you need to do for Angular to understand that this is the controller. So all we really need is a function called meetups controller, and we're going to pass in the scope. And Angular will look for a function inside of, it will look for a function with the name of our controller, and it will inject the scope. The scope is what's used to talk between the view and the controller. So that's how Angular handles managing the binding between these two things and allowing each other to talk. So what we want to do then is on the scope, we'd want to have something called meetups count, right? And let's just hard code one of a meetups count of 10. So if you go back to your index.html, you'll see that meetups count is on the meetups controller, and now we've created this meetups controller. Now to actually get this to be a part of our application, we'll need to go to the index.html, and we'll need to include that script. Because we put it in its own file, it's not actually a part of this application yet, our client. It's not downloaded into our browser yet. So script, we'll do a new tag, and you're going to see here where I put it in client JS controllers, but I'm just going to request JS slash controllers slash meetups controller, right? And I'm going to show you, because we couldn't actually request this JavaScript file anyways, because we need to add JS on the end there, because we haven't added a route in our server yet. We've only added a route for our base URL. So we need to add a route so our server can reply back with JavaScript files. And we'll do a little shortcut and cut that client out so you don't have to say client JS everywhere. So let's flip over to that server. Now in our Express server, we can say app. And what I like to use is some middleware. So we can say app.use. And anytime somebody requests JS, we can use this helper function, express.static. And what we'll do is we'll reply with client.js. This means any file requested inside of the JS, with JS slash JS, any file after that, even if it's in a subfolder, will just be returned statically from Express. And I'm just, shortcutting it so the route doesn't include client. Okay? Hopefully that makes sense. So now we can reply back with any sort of script requests with these static files. So let's go back to our index.html. We've got our meetups controller, controllers, and we should be good. So I'm going to go back to our browser, and I'm going to hit refresh. Now, that's because I didn't restart my server. So I created a new route, but it's saying, hey, it's 404, not found. And that's because I need to restart the server because I created that new route, but it's not delivering the file. So now if I hit refresh, you see it delivered that controller down. Angular bound the two things, the view and the controller, and it displayed the 10 meetups. Awesome, great. So now we're kind of getting started, but let's do something a little bit more interesting. So like I said, we're going to be listing these meetups. So maybe what we want to do is unordered list, and we can use this guy here, and what we can do is we can use ng repeat, which is a nifty little guy from Angular as well. So we can attribute our list item with ng repeat and say for each meetup in meetups, let's do something. Maybe we'll display the meetup.name. Sounds pretty reasonable. Now, we don't have a collection called meetups on our controller yet. So we'll need to go into our controller. And again, on the scope, because that's what's shared between the view and the controller, we'll need to create our meetups collection. And let's just hard code one or a couple of them for now, but we'll make them real soon enough. Mean SF developers. And then maybe we'll do some other, meetup. Okay, great. So now we've got these two guys. If I hit refresh, you can see that it's bound now using ng repeat, and it's going to create a list item for each one in that collection. Awesome, great. Now, we don't want to just hard code these guys, so we probably want to be able to add our own meetups. So let's just go ahead and let's add a form. And inside that form, let's add an input. And let's have that be a type of text. Maybe we have a placeholder that says meetup name. And then we get to use another attribute here called ng model. Great. And with the ng model, the way that this works is anything we define here, it's going to do two-way binding to our controller, actually the scope on the controller. So anything that we type in this text box, we'll have access to on our controller through the scope. So we could just say that this is the meetup name. And let me just close out this input. Great. And so now we'll have access to whatever's typed in here. So we probably want a button. And we probably want that to be a button of type submit. And maybe we'll just say it's called add. Now, we could do a click event here and handle it and pass that into our controller. But I like to use ng submit, and that kind of Angular will handle the submission of the form back to your controller and call a function. And we'll call that function create meetup. All right, great. So on submit, the Angular will call the create meetup function. And all right, so we don't have a create meetup function, so we'll need to go to our controller and we'll need to create one. So again, on the scope, because it's shared between the view and the view controller, we're going to create something called, we're going to create a function called create meetup. And that is a function. And it doesn't take any arguments, and that's because we'll have access to that variable that we defined through ng model. So we'll have on the scope the meetup name, and that's all that we need for this demo. What we could do is let's just scope.meetups. Let's push a new meetup and scope.meetup name. Let's just push a new one each time we click add, okay, with the values that we have. So now I'm refreshing this. I have a form. This is a new meetup, and we'll click add, and there we go. And it's bound to that collection. So there's a couple of things we might want to do. One, this isn't correct anymore because it's hard-coded, and two, this isn't clearing out when we're hitting add. So let's go ahead and clean that up. So first, maybe we'll just clear this out, and it's meetup's name, and we'll just set it to nothing after you add the meetup. And then maybe we don't even need the count anymore because that's hard-coded. And then we can go back here and say meetups.length. So we'll just do that. And then now it says, oh, yep, the length is 2. I create a new meetup, it's 3, it's 4, and it's clearing itself out. Awesome, great. So that is the basic introduction to Angular as well. What we may want to do now, though, is let's make this real. I mean, this application is pretty, basic. It's all done in the client. You see when I refresh, I lose all of my data. So this doesn't really work. It's great for a demo, but it's not real. To do that, and to start to take Angular to the next level and make calls back to our Node server and store it in MongoDB, we'll want to use something called ng-resource. Angular it's an add-on to Angular's base framework. It's a module that you can add on. You do that by just adding another script tag here, Angular-resource, and that'll pull in that extra module, and we can use it in our application. But we haven't defined an Angular application, and we need to tell our application that it has a dependency on ng resource so it can be injected into our modules and our controllers. So we're going to have to get a little bit more sophisticated than what we've been doing. So to create our Angular application, I'm going to go ahead. I like to put it right in my JS folder, and I like to call it app.js. And this is where we can create our Angular module. We'll call it app. I like to call it app. So we have an app on the server side, we have an app on the client side. But we're really just defining an Angular module, and we're going to call it our meetup app. We're going to give it a name, and we're going to tell it that it has a dependency on this ng resource that we just included and downloaded into our client. So now that we have our app defined, though, we have this controller, and he's just sitting out there in space, and he's not a part of this application. So instead, what we want to do, now that we have an app defined, is we want to add this controller to that application so that we'll have access to that ng resource. So we just name it, and then we use this array where we define what the dependencies are that we need for this module or this controller, and they'll be injected into our code, into our controller. So we know that we need scope, so that's one of our dependencies. And now we also, our controller is going to have a dependency on resource. So that's the name for the ng resource. And then as your last parameter, you just do a function and you give those guys a name. I just like to use the same name. All right, so there we go. Let me just pull this down so you can see it. Great. So we said on our app, we're going to add a controller. Its name is Meetup's controller. It has a dependency on scope and a dependency on resource. So Angular will inject those into this function as parameters called scope and resource. So we should be able to take our code out of our controller here, get rid of this kind of free form function just floating around, and put that code here. Great. Now let's make sure everything is working as we expect before we start to use this resource, since we just refactored a few things. So we just added this app.js. We need to call that app.js file and kind of boot up our app. So I'm going to add another script tag, and I'm going to use /js. And remember, we don't have to have a special route for all of these. We're handling all of the /js requests, anything in subfolders and whatnot, and returning those files statically from Express. So I would just say app.js. The other thing we need to do is, remember before when we included Angular and we just said, oh, this whole HTML page is an ng app, which is an Angular app. Well, it didn't have a name. It was just all kind of, you know, floating in space there. So what we want to do is give this a name, Meetup app. So now it knows to use this particular Angular module, which is our application, and then we've configured our controller on it, so it'll also be able to see, our controller here and do all the things that we need to do. So that should work. I'm going to go ahead and hit refresh. I don't see any errors. And then does it all work the same? It does. Great. Awesome. So now we can, now that we've kind of refactored that, we've put a little bit of organization structure around our Angular application, our controller now has access to this ng resource. ng resources are great. This is equivalent of your model, I guess, but the way that it works is if you give it a base URL for your server, for meetups, for example, and it knows how to do all the RESTful operations, get, post, put, delete, and as long as your server follows a standard RESTful API, it makes you not have to deal with as much code on the client side. It handles all the HTTP requests, it handles all of that, and gives you a nice syntax around it. So why don't we take a look at how to use it? One way to use it is, I'm just going to put this back up here. Great. So var, and we're going to say meetup is equal to a new resource, and all we have to do is say what the base URL of our server, our RESTful service is. We haven't created that RESTful service yet, but but we're going to. And we're going to call it API, and we're going to say meetups. So that will be the base URL for our REST resource, for our model, essentially. Okay? And then we can use it. So inside of here, instead of adding the meetup to this this array here, let's go ahead and create a new instance of a meetup. And then we can set a property on that meetup, like name, equal to the scope dot, what was it? Meetup name. Great. And the meetup dot, and it's $save, I believe. Great. So now we're actually going to say, when you say add this meetup, call this function on our controller and on the client side, and our controller on the client side is going to call RESTful service on our server and try to save that there. All right. Now, if I just refresh this and I start to call add, I expect an error. Perfect. I get an error saying that 404 not found on API meetups, and you can see that the verb is post. So it's trying to post to a service that we haven't created yet. And if we look at the network here, and you see this, you can look at the request itself, and you can see that the payload has our JSON object, which is our new meetup that has a name with a value. All right, cool. So let's go to our server now, and let's actually add those routes. So we just say app dot the verb name post for our route, and we are going to say API slash meetups, and on that it will then call a function, and that function would be a request, and it'll be passed a request and a response by express. And we can read values off the request, and we can respond back to the user. Now, I don't like to put all of my code right here, so I would start to organize a little bit more. I would say that there's a folder called server, and then inside of there, and this is what I want to stress, is we're doing MVC on the client side. We're also doing MVC on the server side. So inside of this folder here, I would say controllers, so server, controllers, and then we could create a controller for this route, so for all these meetups. So let's create a new file, and let's call it a meetups controller.js. And inside of here, this is just a Node module. So we're going to require it from our server so that we can use this controller. So the way that Node works is, if you want somebody who requires your module to have access to something, like a function or whatnot, then you need to export it. So we'll just export something, a function called create. And let's just, so you can see, if we go back to this server, we could just take this function out of here, because that's all I'm really doing. I'm just organizing the code better, and I can go to my server, my meetups controller, and I'm just going to put that function there. So I'm really just organizing these controller functions, pulling them away from the routes so that our server just has a nice clean set of routes, and it points to this set of code that's organized in this controller. And inside of here, let's just, for right now, let's console.log, and let's log the request.body. Sound good? Okay. And we'll go back to the server, and now the server needs to pass that to the controller. I would normally do like a namespace. So inside of controllers, I'd create like an index.html or JS, and then I would have, like, the different namespaces for, like, different controllers. So you could say, you could require the controllers folder, and then you could say, controller.meetups, controller.this. But for this demo, we'll just do something a little bit more straightforward. So we'll just say this is the meetups controller, and we'll require, and it's relative, so server slash controllers slash meetup controller. So that is a long thing, so that's why I usually like to, do the namespaces. But we'll just do that for right now. So now we have this meetups controller that we've pulled in, and we can just say meetups controller.create. Great. So now that's just saying when somebody calls this route, call this function on the meetups controller. All right. Now, if we go back, we need to restart the server. Since we made a change on the server, we need to restart it. And I must have misspelled something. Controllers, meetups, plural. So meetups controller. So I just misspelled the name of my controller. So now it says that I'm listening. Great. Let's test this out. So I'm going to refresh this and say this is a test. All right. So I'm running that. Let's just see. We didn't see any errors this time, so it did the post. So if we go back to our terminal, we should see that it console.log the request body. Now we looked at the request body and we saw our JSON was in there, and if we go back and look again, we'll see it again. So we see that this is a test, the body's there. The reason it's saying that it's undefined is because Express doesn't use a body parser by default, so it doesn't recognize the body of this request as JSON and it doesn't parse it. So we just need to quickly include a module that is an Express module called body parser, and then it'll all work. So let's do npm install, and it's body parser, and -- save to put it in our package.json. So that's installing it, and then we go back to our server, and what we can do is say body parser equals require body parser. Okay, and with this body parser, we can just use middleware again. So we can say app.use, and we'll just say for these requests, in the middleware, inject this body parser and see if, parse the body, parse the JSON out. Okay, great. So that's how we use the body parser. Let's just start our server again. Let's go back here. I'll just refresh for good measure, but probably didn't need to. This is from the client, and we'll add it, and no errors, which is good. And then there we go. So on our server, we console.logged the request.body, which is just JSON from our post. Awesome. So now on our server, we want to store this. So we look at our controller that's handling this. We want to store this in our MongoDB database. So what do we do for that? So we could use the native MongoDB drivers for Node and very easily put that in. I like to use something called Mongoose, so a module called Mongoose. It's an ODM, and it allows you to define your schema in your application and then gives you some nice syntax around the driver for that. It's not always the right choice. There are some performance overhead to it, so make your own choice, but for a lot of applications, I really enjoy using, an ODM and using Mongoose specifically. So let's use that. So to do that, what we want to do first is we want to install the module. So So it's npm install Mongoose. Again, -- save, because we've been wanting to keep up with our package.json over here, and it'll keep putting those in there. So all our dependencies will be defined. And while it installs, great. So Mongoose is now installed as a package. We can see it got added as a dependency. And again, all your Node modules are just over here in this folder. We can use it. So let's go into our controller. Actually, let's go into our server-side controller, excuse me. And what we want to do is we want to be able to save this model. Again, we're doing MVC on the server and on the client side. So I wouldn't just start using Mongoose right here. What I would do is I'd create a model object. So if I do a new folder on the server, I would call it models. And inside of that models, I would create a new model or a new file called meetup.js. And this will be the model, the meetup model for Mongoose. And so I'll just create let me just require Mongoose first. Okay, so now I'm using Mongoose, and I'm going to do the most basic and the most simple way to define the schema of your model, but you can do a lot more. So I'd encourage you to check out Mongoose and how you can do all sorts of like validation and these virtuals, and there's a lot that you can do to manage your schema here in your application. Again, this is just a node module, so module.exports, so we want people to be able to have access to our model, and I'm just going to export the whole thing, so like mongoose.model, and that'll return a model, and I'm going to define it as meetup, so that's the name of it, and then I can define the schema, and I'll define the most basic schema. It's a name and it's of type string, and again, there's a lot more we could do. We could say type and then require, we could say this is the type is string and it's required equals true, I think, or something like that. So we can do a lot more. So, but this is the most basic thing, and like I said, this application, we're showing the most basic way for these all to fit together. So Mongoose equals require Mongoose, and then the module, we're exporting the model itself, named meetup, and it has an attribute with a name, type of name attribute, a type of string. Cool. So now we should be able to go back to our controller, and we don't need to use Mongoose here, but what we want to do is we want to define our meetup model. So again, I would normally do a namespace for models and controllers. So you can say model.meetup and models.meetup and this type of thing, but we'll just require it directly. It's relative, so we just need to do models, meetup, great. Now, this is going to look very familiar. So remember the resource on the client side, we had a model essentially, and here we have a model. So let's create a new instance of that model because we want to create a new one. So meetup equals new meetup, and this time I can just pass the request.body directly into the constructor of this meetup because it's JSON, so it's just going to set the value name equal to the property on this model of name. And then I can just say meetup.save. Now that should save it to my Mongoose database, my MongoDB database. Okay, not Mongoose. Mongoose is the ODM, MongoDB is the database. One thing I need to do before that happens, though, is I actually need to connect to the MongoDB database. So I'd go back into my server. My server also needs Mongoose. And again, we can organize this server in different ways. We can talk about best practices. For this demo purposes, I'm kind of putting this connection here. So we also need to require Mongoose. And all we have to do is when we start up our node server, say mongoose connect. Whoops. And if you remember, we had our MongoDB and local host, and I can't remember the port, but because we're running it locally, or basically this is, we're saying that we're sending it the location. We're giving it the location of our server essentially. So MongoDB localhost. Let me flip back to the running server, and I see, yeah, it was port yada yada. Great. So 27017, and the database that we used, I believe, was mean demo. So this is the syntax to show where that MongoDB is, that instance is. So now that should connect, and Mongoose does a good job of handling the connection, so if you're making requests, it handles all of that. So don't have to worry about a race condition, I don't think. Great. Let's go ahead and restart our server. Whoops, that was my MongoDB server. Let's restart our Node server. It says that it's listening. Let's go here and just for good measure refresh and say this is from the client. We'll say add. We don't have any errors. Let's go back here, and now we should with our Mongo client. I think I might have to reconnect it because I stopped the server. And then use mean demo. So we're using the database. So we're now connected to our MongoDB instance. And I think we could just say find meetups. And yep, we see the other two meetups that we had put in there before. And then you see this new meetup. This is from the client. So it actually saved it to the MongoDB database. Awesome, great. Now, one thing we talked about earlier is that this isn't synchronous code. So this looks like you can't say var, result equals this, and after you save it, the result goes in there. The way that it works is it's done via callback because it's asynchronous. So you say function, and the standard JavaScript callback syntax is error first, and then the result. And then you can do what you need to do with that result. So what we can do with that result, because we're always talking in JSON all the way from client to server to database, we just get to pass it right down. So we can just say respond with JSON with the result, and that's actually going to send that result back down to the client with an ID on it and everything. So we can go to our client and go into the controller and say, okay, so where you said save, it also has this callback. And I think for this guy, I'll just do result without the error. And then I could set now that new meetup onto our collection. So we have this scope meetups here, right? So I'll just push it onto that. So scope meetup push, meetups push, and I'll just say the result because again, it's JSON. So we're starting to see the beauty of this stack. We're going end to end here, and we're not having to reformat the model data as we're pushing it from database to server to client. So it's pretty cool. Yeah, so let's see if that works. So let's go ahead and restart the server. Okay. And then let's go ahead and refresh this. And if you saw that error a second ago, it's because we didn't really respond back ever. We just said like save, but we didn't respond back, and that's what we're doing now. And so it was actually still had an open connection on that post, and it was just sitting there. So you do need to respond back, and you need to close that request response loop. So you don't want to just say .save and then be done. You need to also respond back with at least like a 200 or something to your client. Otherwise, they'll just be sitting there open. So this is a test, and then if I hit that, that goes all the way to the server, and it stores it in the database, and it comes back and it puts it on the collection. Awesome. I don't like that it doesn't clear that out, so it just bothers me. So why don't we just do that again? So we'll say scope.meetup name, and that's just the text input value that we're going to clear out. I can do this, and here we go. Awesome. So the downside is that or the thing that we need to do next is that we're still like hard coding these first two, and then we're only storing some of these arrays. So let's go ahead and actually pull all the meetups down from the database, and then we'll basically be done. So go back to our server here. We want to take out these hard-coded guys. We don't need those. And again, this isn't necessarily best practice, but for the demo purposes, all you would need to do is when your controller gets created, you could say meetup.query. That's the syntax to find meetups, and it's going to use a GET request against these guys, against our API meetups. So that query, and then the function will return a result. So what happens after that query? Because I didn't have any, parameters or anything, so I just pass in the function to call back with the results. I'll call it results because it's a list. And then I could just say, let's just say at scope.meetups, and we'll just set the whole list equal to the results. All right. Great. Now, that's not going to work, though, unless we create a GET route for our RESTful service for meetups, because we don't have that route. So if I refresh, you can see it's using the verb GET, and it's trying to call the API for meetups, and it's getting a 404. So we just go back to our server, and this should be pretty easy to add now. So we already have our post route for meetups, so now we have our GET. So we're starting to create our REST API here, right? And instead of it calling the create method on our controller for meetups, we'll have it call the list method. And we'll go to our server-side controller, and again, we'll just do module.exports, and this time a function called list, and it'll take a request and a response, and inside of here, we can just say meetups.find, so it's just a little bit different syntax from the client resource, but meetups.find for Mongoose, and Mongoose is going to return either an error or results, plural because it's a list, and then we can just respond back with JSON again with the results, and our client should be able to display it. So let's restart our server, which we can talk about some tools so you don't need to keep restarting your server and set up your environment, a little bit better. And then I refresh this, and it's pulling it from the database. So this is a new one. And we'll add it, and I refresh, and now we have 9 because it's stored in MongoDB. So that is a very basic end-to-end description of how to work with each of these technologies at their very, very, very basic kind of level. Let's flip back into our presentation and kind of finish off the talk. So we went through AngularJS. Now you might say, wow, you were typing a lot, and you didn't set up your project in a way that it could, scale. Well, there's a lot of great examples out there on how you can get started a little bit faster. You don't need to write all that code. You don't need to do all of that plumbing all the time. There's a lot of seed projects out there that try to set forward a good practice for organization. I did client server and then JS and controllers. You might have directives and filters and services and these other things. But there's different opinions out there on how to set up that folder structure. This is one of them. This is a seed, and then they also have generators using Yeoman to generate a lot of that scaffolding for you. So if you say, oh, I need to introduce a new model and I'm going to do a bunch of CRUD work, they can create a lot of those controllers and those RESTful APIs and these different parts of your application via these generators. So that's pretty nice. Now it locks you into conventions inside of your project. The other thing about mean.js is I organized it with JS and then controllers and directives and filters and these different kind of types of modules for Angular, for example. That works well for a small to medium-sized project. But then if your project starts to get really big and you have a lot of different modules and a lot of different pieces of your application, you may want to organize it by module instead of by type. And mean.js shows how to do that. They organize theirs by module. So you might have a users module, and then inside of that users module, you can have controllers and filters and services and directives and these different things. So I kind of like that organization if you're expecting your application to grow and have complexity. So check them out. They're pretty cool. I know other people like Mean.io, so they have seed and generator. They have a seed project as well as generators, and you can see it's like you install the Mean.io and then you can use this to initialize your application, and it'll create a lot of that skeleton and that scaffolding that we were just kind of building ourselves, and then it'll give you a good starting point and some best practices. They even include tools and things that you might want to use. So yeah, check those out. So speaking of tools, Grunt is what I'm using for task manager. So it's a JavaScript task runner. So you noticed that we were like creating a lot of JavaScript files and we were adding them to index.html. And if you've done this before and you've deployed it out there, I mean, a large application could have, hundreds of files, and these, or, even if it had 20 files, that would be too many because the browser limits how many files you can download at a time. So your application would be very slow to load. It'd probably error. There's a lot of problems with that. So you need to, when you're building an application like this, use things like concat and minification and uglification of your JavaScript. You need to combine them all into one file that then gets included and downloaded. So to manage those types of tasks so that you can keep your code organized and separated, but then pull it all together for production deployment, tools like Grunt are great. I think the new hotness is Gulp, so you may want to check that out. I haven't had a chance to check it out, but yeah, so I'm using Grunt, and there you can do a lot of other great things with it. I kept restarting my server. You can set up watches that'll see when you've changed a file and restart your server for you, and even like live reload everything, which is great. So you have a better workflow with your development environment. We can go into more depth about tools in another talk, but that's one that I just wanted to point out. So that's basically the talk. That's the intro to the stack as fast as I can go to build an application. Definitely call for speakers. I'm really interested in continuing to create this community. I hope you guys enjoyed this. If you guys have topics or things that you want to talk about, email me, let me know, hit up the meetup group. Happy to brainstorm. Yep, got done.